In the autumn of 1897, in a valley east of Eureka, California, two men stood on wooden planks 12 feet above the forest floor, wedged into notches they had chopped into the trunk of a coast redwood. The tree rose above them, straight and unbroken, for 310 feet. That's the height of a 30-story building. From where they stood, they couldn't see the top. The crown was lost in fog and canopy. The trunk at their feet measured 28 feet across. The wood inside represented enough lumber to frame 40 houses. Their job was to bring it down, with axes and a crosscut saw. No harnesses, no ropes, no safety equipment of any kind. Just two springboards, a misery whip, and the understanding that if the tree didn't fall the way they planned, they would die. One of the men, a Swedish immigrant named Eric Lindstrom, had been falling timber for 11 years. He had seen men killed by barber chairs, by widowmakers, by trees that kicked sideways and crushed the faller before he could run. He knew the risks in his bones. The other man, his partner John Mackey, was newer, only 3 years in the woods, but he had learned from Lindstrom and he trusted him. Together, they would spend the next 4 days cutting this single tree. 4 days, standing on planks that flexed underfoot. 4 days pulling a 12-foot saw through wood so dense it felt like iron. 4 days knowing that one miscalculation, one moment of inattention, could end with 10,000 tons of living timber falling the wrong direction and erasing them from existence. This is the story of the men who felled the tallest trees on Earth using nothing but hand tools, balance, and a kind of courage that doesn't exist in the modern world. To men who worked at heights that would terrify a construction worker, on platforms with no railings, no anchors, nothing but friction and faith keeping them from falling. Men who read a forest the way a sailor reads the sea, and bet their lives on their ability to predict what a 300-foot tree would do in the 3 seconds after it started to fall. Let's start with the trees themselves, because nothing about old-growth logging makes sense until you understand the scale. Coast redwoods, Sequoia sempervirens, are the tallest trees on Earth. The current record holder stands 380 feet, but in the 1800s, before logging, there were likely trees that exceeded 400 feet. These weren't just tall, they were massive in every dimension. A redwood 300 feet tall might have a trunk 15 or 20 feet in diameter at the base, tapering gradually toward the crown. The bark alone could be a foot thick, fibrous, and fire-resistant, soft enough that you could punch it and leave a dent. The wood inside was dense, fine-grained, and rot-resistant. It didn't warp, it didn't crack when it dried. You could cut a redwood, mill it into boards, and those boards would last a century without treatment. For a nation building itself out of wood, redwood was gold, and the forests were full of it. In the 1850s, when American loggers first entered the redwood belt in Northern California, they found groves where the trees stood so close their crowns interlocked. The light that reached the forest floor was dim and green, filtered through hundreds of feet of foliage. The ground was covered in ferns, sorrel, and a thick layer of duff, centuries of fallen needles composted into a soft mat. But walking through an old-growth redwood forest was like walking through a cathedral. The trunks rose like columns, straight and branchless for 100 feet or more. The silence was profound. The scale was overwhelming, and the men who came to cut these trees had to invent on the ground methods to bring them down without killing themselves. The first challenge was where to cut. You couldn't cut a redwood at ground level. The base of the tree, the butt, flared outward in massive buttresses that could extend 10 or 15 feet from the trunk. Cutting through that much wood would take weeks. And the wood at the base was often twisted, gnarled, filled with burls and irregularities that made it nearly impossible to saw. So the fallers worked from springboards. A springboard was a plank, usually 6 to 8 feet long, 6 inches wide, and 2 inches thick, and made from strong, straight-grained wood. One end was sharpened to a chisel point and shod with an iron sleeve. The other end, where the faller would stand, was left flat. The faller would chop a notch into the trunk, angled slightly upward, 6 or 8 or 10 feet above the ground. Then he would jam the pointed end of the springboard into the notch, driving it in with a sledgehammer or the back of his axe. The board would cantilever out from the tree, supported only by the friction of the iron sleeve wedged into the wood. Then he would step onto it. Standing on a springboard required balance and nerve. The board flexed under your weight. It bounced slightly when you moved. There was no railing, no harness, no rope connecting you to the tree. If you lost your balance, you fell 10 feet onto ground that was often uneven. Covered in roots and debris, a fall could break a leg, crack a skull, or if you were unlucky, impale you on a broken branch. The fallers learned to move carefully, to keep their weight centered, to never make a sudden movement. They worked in caulked boots, leather boots with sharp steel spikes driven through the soles, designed to grip the bark and the wet wood of the springboard. The spikes bit into the surface, giving you traction, but they also committed you to every step. You couldn't slide your foot. You had to lift it and place it. Every movement was deliberate. Once both men were on their springboards, positioned on opposite sides of the tree at the same height, they would begin the undercut. The undercut was a wedge-shaped notch chopped into the side of the tree facing the direction you wanted it to fall. The undercut determined everything. If the undercut was angled correctly, the tree would fall clean, hinging on the uncut wood and dropping exactly where you planned. If the undercut was wrong, the tree could twist, split, or fall in an unpredictable direction. Chopping the undercut was an art. The fallers used double-bit axes with a blade on each side of the head. One blade kept razor sharp for cutting, the other slightly duller for rough work. They would swing in rhythm, alternating blows, each swing removing a chip of wood the size of a dinner plate. The sound echoed through the forest, a steady percussion that could be heard half a mile away. Chop, 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 hour after hour. The undercut on a large redwood could take a full day to chop. The notch had to be deep, sometimes 6 or 8 feet into the trunk, and it had to be precise. The angle of the undercut, usually around 45 degrees, controlled how the tree would hinge. Too steep, and the tree would sit back, pinching your saw when you started the back cut. Too shallow and the tree wouldn't have enough guidance, and it could twist as it fell. The depth mattered too. The undercut had to remove enough wood that the tree's center of gravity would shift forward once the back cut was made. But if you cut too deep, you weakened the hinge, and the tree could barber chair, split vertically up the trunk and kick back toward you with lethal force. After the undercut was finished, the fallers would move to the backside of the tree and set up for the back cut. The back cut was made with a crosscut saw, a long, flexible saw with a handle on each end and teeth designed to cut on the pull stroke. The saw used on big timber was called a misery whip, and the name was earned. A falling saw for redwood work could be 12 feet long, sometimes longer. The blade was thin, flexible, and lined with cutting teeth, interspersed with raker teeth that cleared the sawdust from the cut. The saw weighed 40 or 50 pounds, and you pulled it back and forth through dense, wet wood for hours. The rhythm of the saw was critical. One man pulled, the other let the saw glide back. Pull, don't push. Pushing buckled the blade and wasted energy. The saw only cut on the pull. Each stroke removed a thin layer of wood, maybe a 1/16 of an inch. To cut through a trunk 20 feet in diameter, you had to pull the saw thousands of times. Your shoulders burned. Your hands blistered, then bled, then calloused into leather. The saw would gum up with sap and sawdust. You'd have to stop every few minutes, pull the saw out, scrape the blade clean, maybe file the teeth to keep them sharp, then back to work. And all of this was happening 10 feet in the air, standing on a springboard that bounced with every motion. The fallers developed a stance, knees slightly bent, weight on the balls of their feet, using their legs to absorb the flex of the board. They learned to read the saw by feel. If the saw started to bind, if it felt tight in the cut, that meant the tree was starting to sit back, pinching the blade. You'd have to stop, drive a wedge into the cut behind the saw to hold it open, then keep cutting. The wedges were wooden or steel, driven in with a sledgehammer. They kept the cut open and also helped tip the tree forward, shifting its weight toward the undercut. As the back cut went deeper, on the fallers watched for signs, the tree would start to talk. You'd hear creaking sounds, small pops as fibers began to separate. You'd feel vibrations through the springboard. The tree was getting ready to go. When the back cut was within a few inches of the undercut, leaving a hinge of uncut wood in the center, The fallers would pull the saw out, grab their axes, and get off the springboards. Fast. Because once the tree started to move, you had seconds to clear the area. The moment of the fall was the payoff and the test. If everything had been done right, the tree would lean forward slowly, almost gently at first. The hinge wood would bend, controlling the direction. The crown, 300 feet up, would start to tip, then gravity would take over. The tree would accelerate, the top arcing downward, the trunk pivoting on the hinge. The sound was unlike anything else, a tearing, groaning roar as thousands of tons of wood ripped free from the stump. The air itself seemed to vibrate, and then the impact. When a 300-foot redwood hit the ground, the earth shook. You could feel it through your boots, a physical shock that traveled through the soil. The crown, hitting first, would explode. Branches the size of normal trees would snap off and fly through the air. The trunk would bounce, sometimes breaking in half from the force of the impact. Dust, bark, and debris would fill the air, and then silence. The forest would go quiet, as if shocked by the violence. The fallers would stand there, breathing hard, and assess. Did the tree fall where they planned? Was it intact? Did anyone get hurt? If the tree fell clean, it was a victory. Months of planning, days of cutting, and it worked. But if something went wrong, if the tree barber chaired or twisted or fell the wrong direction, men died. A barber chair was the nightmare scenario. It happened when the tree split vertically before the back cut was complete. The compression forces inside the trunk, amplified by the tree's weight and lean, would cause the wood to fail along the grain. The trunk would split upward, sometimes 50 or 100 feet into the air, and the butt, the bottom section still attached to the stump, would kick backward with explosive force. There was no warning. 1 second you were pulling a saw. The next, thousands of pounds of wood were flying at you faster than you could react. Men were impaled, crushed, killed instantly. Eric Lindstrom had seen it happen. In 1892, he had been working with a partner named Tom Halverson on a Douglas fir near Coos Bay, Oregon. The tree was leaning slightly into the wind, and they had accounted for that in the undercut. But as they made the back cut, the wind shifted. The tree started to sit back. They drove wedges. The tree still sat back. Halverson decided to cut deeper, to force the tree over. Lindstrom told him to stop, to walk away, to leave the tree and come back another day. Halverson ignored him. He kept cutting. The tree barber chaired. The split propagated up the trunk with a sound like a rifle shot. The butt kicked back and hit Halverson in the chest. He was dead before he hit the ground. Lindstrom pulled his body out from under the log and carried it back to camp. He never spoke about it, but he never forgot, and he never cut a tree that was sitting back. If the tree wanted to sit, he walked away. There would be other trees. The men who did this work were not reckless. They were cautious to the point of superstition. They read the wind. They watched the canopy for widowmakers, dead branches or broken tops that could fall without warning during the cutting. They checked the lean of the tree, not just visually, but by feel, tapping the trunk with an axe and listening to the tone. A tree leaning hard would sound different than a balanced tree. They planned escape routes, paths they would take when the tree started to fall, cleared of debris and obstacles, and they trusted their partners. Falling big timber was always a two-man job. You needed someone on the other end of the saw, someone to watch your back, someone who would pull you out if things went wrong. The pay reflected the skill and the danger. A faller in the California redwoods in the 1890s could make $4 or $5 a day, sometimes more if the timber was especially difficult. That was double or triple what a mill worker made. But the work was seasonal. The rainy season, from November through March, made the woods too dangerous. The ground was slick, the springboards were wet, the trees were unpredictable. Most fallers worked from April through October, saved their money, and lived on it through the winter. Some spent their winters in the logging towns, in Eureka or Arcata or Crescent City. Others went south to San Francisco and blew their money on drinking, gambling, and women. By spring, they'd be broke and back in the woods. The camps they lived in were rough. Bunkhouses, long wooden buildings with rows of beds. No privacy, no heat except for a wood stove at each end. The food was basic, but plentiful. Beans, pork, potatoes, bread, coffee strong enough to strip paint. Meals were eaten in silence because talking wasted time. You ate, you worked, you slept. There was no entertainment, no books because most of the men couldn't read. No music, except what someone might play on a harmonica or a fiddle if they had one. The camps were dry, no alcohol allowed, because drunk men and sharp tools were a fatal combination. If you wanted to drink, you waited until you went to town. The men who stood on those springboards, 10 feet up, with nothing but a plank and their balance between them and a fall, didn't have anyone filming them. They didn't have anyone telling the world what they were doing. But you're here now. You're watching their story. If you believe these men, the ones who felled trees taller than most buildings with hand tools and raw nerve, deserve to be remembered, hit subscribe. This channel exists because people like you refuse to let history be forgotten. We're not just watching old stories. We're keeping them alive. These men didn't expect to be remembered. But here you are. That matters. The injuries were constant and brutal. Axes slipped and cut through boots, severing tendons and breaking bones. Saws kicked back and gashed arms and chests. Men fell from springboards and broke legs, ribs, backs. In the remote camps, there were no doctors. The cook or the camp boss would set broken bones using splints made from wood and cloth. Infections were common. Gangrene could set in, and if it did, the choice was amputation or death. Some men were sent to town and to the hospital in Eureka. Most didn't make it. The roads were rough, the journey took days, and by the time they arrived, the infection had spread too far. The company would bury them and send a letter to the family if there was one. Most of the men were single, drifters, immigrants with no ties. They died alone and were buried in unmarked graves in small cemeteries near the camps. But the widowmakers were the silent killers. A widowmaker was a broken branch or a section of dead wood lodged high in the canopy, invisible from the ground. It could sit there for years, held in place by other branches, slowly weakening. Then one day, during a cutting operation, the vibration from the saw or the impact of a falling tree would shake it loose. It would fall 200 feet, accelerating, and hit whoever was below. There was no warning. No time to react. 1 second you were working. The next, a 500-pound branch hit you from above and drove you into the ground. Widowmakers killed experienced men as often as they killed rookies. There was no skill that protected you, just luck. In 1903, Eric Lindstrom was working a grove near the Eel River with a new partner, a young man named Samuel Ortiz. They had just finished the undercut on a large redwood and were setting up for the back cut. Lindstrom was on his springboard on one side of the tree. Ortiz was on the other side, adjusting his board. A widowmaker, a broken top from a tree that had been felled weeks earlier, had been lodged in the canopy of the redwood they were cutting. The vibration from their axework shook it loose. It fell. Lindstrom saw it. He shouted. Ortiz looked up. The widowmaker hit him square on the head and drove him off the springboard. He was dead before he hit the ground. Lindstrom climbed down, checked the body, and walked back to camp. He reported the death to the camp boss. The body was buried the next day. Lindstrom took a week off. Then he went back to work. There was nothing else to do. The technique of springboard falling was used across the Pacific Northwest, not just in the redwoods. In Washington and Oregon, fallers used the same methods on Douglas fir, Sitka spruce, and western red cedar. The trees were smaller than the redwoods, but still massive. A 200-foot Douglas fir with a trunk 8 feet across required the same skills, the same tools, the same risks. The springboards were essential because the butt swell on these trees made ground-level cutting impractical. And the fallers, many of whom moved between regions following the work, carried the knowledge with them. Techniques developed in the California redwoods were applied in British Columbia. Methods refined in Oregon were used in Northern California. The craft spread through the camps, passed from experienced men to green crews, learned through apprenticeship and survival. By the early 1900s, the technology was starting to change. The first gasoline-powered chainsaws appeared around 1905, but they were massive two-man machines that weighed over 100 pounds and were nearly as slow as a crosscut saw. They were used experimentally, but most fallers stuck with the misery whip because it was proven and reliable. It wasn't until the 1940s, with the development of lighter, one-man chainsaws, that hand falling began to decline. Even then, like many old-timers refused to use the new tools. They didn't trust engines. They understood steel and wood and muscle. A chainsaw could fail. A saw wouldn't, as long as you kept it sharp. The last of the old-growth redwood was logged by the 1960s. What remains today is protected in state and national parks. You can walk through these groves and see trees that survived the logging era. They stand as monuments, not to conservation, but to luck. They were in areas too steep to log, too remote to access, or simply overlooked. The vast majority of the old growth, the groves that covered over 2 million acres, are gone. Cut and milled and turned into houses, water tanks, fences, and furniture. The wood has outlasted the men who cut it. The houses built with redwood in the 1890s are still standing, the siding barely weathered. The framing as solid as the day it was installed. Samuel Ortiz, Tom Halverson, the men whose names were recorded only because they died, and the hundreds more who fell from springboards, who were crushed by barber chairs, who were buried in unmarked graves near the camps they worked. Nobody was filming when they died. No one was there to document their courage or their sacrifice. But we are now. If you think their memory matters, if you believe the men who built America's cities with timber cut from 30-story trees deserve to be known, subscribe. You're helping make sure these men are never forgotten. That's not just watching history. That's honoring it. The environmental cost of old-growth logging is still being calculated. The redwood forests that remain are a fraction of what existed before 1850. The ecosystems that depended on those forests, the biodiversity, the complex relationships between the trees and the species that lived in and around them, much of that is gone. Second-growth forests are growing back, but they're different. Thinner trees, closer spacing, less structural complexity. The groves will never be what they were. And the knowledge that we cut them, that we reduced forests that had stood for 2,000 years to stumps in less than a century, is a weight we carry. But the men who did the cutting didn't see it that way. They saw resources. They saw jobs. They saw the opportunity to build something, to send money home, to carve a life out of the wilderness. They weren't thinking about legacy or conservation. They were thinking about the next tree, the next paycheck, the next season. And they did work that required a kind of bravery that's hard to comprehend today. Standing on a plank 10 feet in the air, pulling a saw through a tree that could kill you if you made one mistake, doing it for 12 hours a day, 6 days a week, in all weather. That's not recklessness. That's commitment. That's skill. That's the kind of work that built a nation, even if the cost was a forest. The springboards are gone. The last commercial hand-falling operations using springboards ended in the 1950s. A few springboards survive in museums, mounted on display with plaques explaining what they were used for. But the words don't convey the reality. You have to imagine standing on one, feeling it flex, looking up at 300 feet of tree above you, and knowing that your life depends on reading the wood correctly. The photos that remain, on grainy black and white images of men standing on springboards with saws in hand, give a sense of the scale, but not the fear, not the skill, not the understanding that one mistake meant death. Some of you have been here since the beginning. You're not just watching these stories anymore. You're part of something bigger. If you want to go deeper into the history of the men who felled the tallest trees on Earth, if you want early access to videos before anyone else sees them, if you want to be part of the tribe that keeps these stories alive and makes sure the next generation knows what their ancestors achieved, join the membership. It's for the people who don't just consume history. They carry it forward. The link is in the description. You'll get early access, behind-the-scenes research notes, and you'll be supporting the work that makes these stories possible. Our members are the reason we can keep digging into archives, finding the forgotten men, and bringing them back to life. If that sounds like you, if you want to honor the legacy of the fallers who stood on springboards with nothing but skill and courage between them and a 300-foot fall, the membership is waiting below. Eric Lindstrom worked in the woods until 1921. He was 56 years old. His lungs were damaged from decades of breathing sawdust. His hands were gnarled with arthritis from swinging axes and pulling saws. He could barely hear from years of standing next to falling trees. He retired to a small house in Eureka and lived on savings and a small pension from the timber company. He died in 1928. His obituary in the local paper was 3 sentences long. It listed his name, his age, and the fact that he had worked as a faller. It did not mention how many trees he had cut, how many men he had worked with, or how many times he had looked death in the face and walked away. Those stories died with him, but the trees he cut are still standing. Not the living trees, those are gone, but the wood, in the framing of old houses, in the siding on barns, in the beams holding up buildings that have weathered a century of earthquakes, fires, and storms. The redwood that Lindstrom and men like him pulled out of the mountains with hand tools is still doing its job, still bearing weight, still lasting. The men are gone, the forest is diminished, but the wood remains. And in that wood, if you know where to look, is the legacy of men who worked at impossible heights, with impossible tools, and did impossible things because the world demanded it and they were the ones willing to do it. They stood on springboards 10 feet in the air and felled trees 30 stories tall with saws and axes and nothing else. No harnesses, no safety nets, no second chances. Just skill, courage, and the knowledge that if you didn't get it right, the tree would kill you. They got it right, thousands of times, and the nation they built with that timber is still standing.